think we are live now. Thank you all for coming to the Canada Science and Technology Museum Google Hangout series with the Canadian Energy Literacy Network. We do these webinars the last Thursday of every month, and it's an opportunity to gather together people who have an interest in climate, energy, and education. We don't host the webinars over the summer, so you won't have seen us for the last couple of months. We know everyone's busy and away on vacation, so this is going to be our first one of our fall series. We'll also be hosting one in October and November, and then resume back in 2017. The Let's Talk Energy program sees these webinars as a great opportunity to gather people who are interested in that climate and energy piece. If you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to ask. You can type them in on the side. And if you want to also continue the discussion past this, you can post comments to our Facebook page, which is Let's Talk Energy, or you can tweet us during the presentation or after. And on Twitter, we have our hashtag @EnerTweets. Hashtag Talk Energy, and our handle is @EnerTweets. Today, we're going to be examining a program called the Global Calculator. This software allows users to adjust a whole bunch of different human activities and to see the effects of adjusting these variables on greenhouse gas emissions. The goal is to see if the user can keep the greenhouse gas emissions to a certain level to maintain the climate under 2 degrees by 2050. This is especially relevant, of course, right now with COP22 coming up in Morocco later this fall. As well, Canada is planning on holding its some parliamentary debates next week on the ratification of the Paris Agreement. To come into effect, the Paris Agreement needs 55 countries signing on that represent 55% of the emissions. Right now, there's 61 countries who have signed on, and the total is nearly 48%. So we're getting close globally to agreement, but we're not quite there yet. So it's still important that the remaining countries who have signed on, which was more than 190, continue that ratification. So helping us today work through the software and explain how it can be used as an educational tool, we have Laura Aylett. She's project manager for Global Calculator, which is an initiative of the United Kingdom's Department of Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy. I'm going to ask participants to join Laura on their own computers and to go onto the software, and you'll be able to play around with it as Laura's explaining it to us. She'll be walking us through with both a presentation and some demonstrations on the website, but it'll give you probably a good idea to see how it works if you're trying it out yourself. The tool can be found at tool.globalcalculator.org. If you just Google Global Calculator, you will come up, and you can follow the links there. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and we'll let her take it away and give us a demonstration of the software. Thanks, Laura.
Hi. It's very nice to be here and to be discussing the tool with you, because I think it's a tool that has a lot of educational possibilities and really can bring together a lot of things from the energy literacy sort of space, because it includes a lot of different energy sources and presents them in quite an interactive way. So my name's Laura, and I work, as Jason said, at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK. And we launched the Global Calculator very early last year, so it's been around for about a year. And already we have had quite a few universities and colleges use it. And I think it could be used at a slightly younger level as well, maybe high school. Some of them are in Canada. And so, yeah, I'm very happy to talk to you today about the project. I'm going to switch over to share my screen, and then I'll take you through a quick presentation. After that, as part of that presentation, I'll give a live demonstration of the tool, because it can seem, it doesn't make much sense until you see it, and then quite quickly it should make a lot of sense about what we're talking about. So I'm just going to start sharing my entire screen. So hopefully you will all be able to see what I can see. And now I'm going to switch over here to the Global Calculator. So if you go to tool.globalcalculator.org, this should be what you are seeing. But, oh, actually I meant to go, wait a sec, presentation first. Here we go. So the Global Calculator is a free and interactive tool that helps you understand the link between our lifestyles, but also the energy that we use at a worldwide level, and what those mean for the consequences for our climate. So it puts the user in charge of the world's energy, land and food systems from now until 2050. And it includes the full range of possible scenarios for the future. So you can try out all the different technologies, different behavior change options, and see what impact they have. The possible scenarios, you know, what is possible has been determined by talking to experts from around the world. So it was done in a very open and transparent way. We had a call for evidence period. Once using the tool, you can instantly work out the implications of your choices on the energy system, but also on people's lifestyles, people's homes, the way they travel, and also, importantly, on the world's climate. There are 3 principles behind the tool when we were running this project. The first was openness. The calculator approach has been described as radically open and transparent. It's an Excel-based model underneath. So we're going to look at the web interface, which is freely available for anyone online. But if you're really interested and a little bit nerdy, then you can go and download the spreadsheet from our website and look at all the numbers and calculations that go behind that tool. So if you don't agree with us, you can change those numbers and create your own version that matches your view of the world, for example. It's also a very collaborative project. We worked with organisations from around the world, each one taking on a different sector of the model. So it wasn't just a UK government project. It was funded by our, I should have updated this slide because we've changed name from the Department of Energy and Climate Change to the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy recently, but we still do climate change. So we worked with, we co-funded it from our aid budget, our International Climate Fund, because we're talking about, you know, international development issues as part of the project, and got co-financing from an EU organisation called Climate Kick. And then we worked with the World Resources Institute in Washington, developed the transport sector. The International Energy Agency gave us a lot of the data. Climact, as an organisation in Belgium, they did the industrial sector. Energy Research and Development International is part of the Chinese government's Energy Research Institute. So it's quite an unusual sort of joint British-Chinese government project. We also work with universities like Imperial College London, in Ernst & Young, so yeah, from Ernst & Young India actually, so a really international project. It's also an unusually simple model of the world's energy system. So there are other world energy models, but you can't run them from a computer just using the internet. You need special software and a license and a lot of time to learn how to use it. So we've tried to make it as intuitive as possible and easy to use. To do that requires quite a lot of simplification and rolling up a lot of big choices into a fewer number of big choices. But we had this mantra that we were going to be as simple as possible without being wrong. So we wanted to keep the accuracy there. So it was a very interesting juggling act when building the tool. So how does it work? Well, if you have it open, this is what you will see. This is the interactive web interface. And at the bottom of that, you have the sort of dashboard, I like to call it. You have a set of 40 levers that allow you to control the energy system and people's lifestyles. So they let you vary the way we live in the future, and that's at the bottom half of the screen. And in the top half of the screen, you have a number of graphs that will move when you make your choices in the bottom half. So you click one of the levers at the bottom half of the screen, and the graphs above will instantly change to show you the impacts of your choices on energy demand, energy supply, emissions, temperature, the amount people travel, how many cars people have, all sorts of different things. Yeah, the important thing here is the thermometer. If you're going to play this like a game, then the thermometer is what you need to look at, because that thermometer shows you the temperature change range by 2100 based on your choices. So you can either build a pathway yourself using the buttons at the bottom half of the screen, or you can choose from a list of ready-made pathways that we developed. We developed some of them ourselves. We worked with organisations that have much more complex models than ours to recreate their outputs. So you can look at the International Energy Agency's pathways. You can look at some from companies like Shell, from NGOs like Friends of the Earth has a pathway. So the idea is that whoever you are and whatever your view of the world, you should be able to create your vision of the future using the tool. So I've talked about levers, these buttons at the bottom half of the screen. And for each one of those, each row represents an action that we could do to reduce emissions. So that could be on the demand side or the supply side. So we could build nuclear, for example, because that's a low carbon source, or we could move from cars to public transport. For each lever, you have 4 options, 4 levels. You have level 1, which is the minimum effort we think is likely. It's sort of a worst case scenario. What would happen if we don't have any international agreements, national level policies to reduce emissions? What would happen to that technology or behavior change if we don't try and actively change things? So it's a sort of high emission scenario. Level 2 is what most experts think is ambitious but achievable. Level 3 is very ambitious but achievable. And level 4 is extraordinarily ambitious. So the most extreme the experts think we could achieve by 2050. So a sort of Apollo program level of effort. If we do nothing else but try and build nuclear power stations around the world, or to change people's behavior, what do we think we could achieve? So we spoke to, for each sector, we got experts in a room and asked them to sort of brainstorm this, give us evidence, the best evidence available, to sort of set what level 1, 2, 3, and 4 is for each solution. So, for example, before we move to the tool, for the nuclear power option, we wanted to include the full range of options because obviously nuclear power is quite controversial. Lots of people don't like it. Some people are zealots for it. So you should have the full range of options to choose from. So level 1 would be the high emission scenario. So 0 gigawatts of nuclear power around the world by 2050. So what would happen if we really moved away from nuclear? When the power stations get old, we don't replace them, we don't build any more. So you can see that's the blue line fading out to nothing by 2050. Level 2 would be 685 gigawatts by 2050. So you can see that's sort of increasing around the same level as we've had over the last few years. Level 3 is an increase in the rate of building these things. So the green line, we're going up to over 1,000 gigawatts by 2050. And then level 4 is 1,870 gigawatts, the red line. So a significant increase in build rates. The limiting factor in the nuclear power example is probably the time it takes to plan and build these sort of things. That's the limiting factor. But for some other things like solar power, that might be space is the limiting factor. What is the amount of land area we could cover in solar panels? A demand side example here is travel mode, so the switch to public transport. So we have level 1 would be that 65% of journeys are by car in the future. So that's the upper light blue line there. So an increase in the rate of car use. Car use is going up around the world. We have a growing population, a developing population. There are lots of people in the world that don't have cars now that would like to. So what would happen if we don't have policies to reduce that? We would expect a significant rise in the usage of cars. Level 2 is to have 53%, so that's still a rise based on today's. Level 3 go down to 43%, so only a modest rise. And level 4 is a decrease, an absolute decrease from today's level. So that is very ambitious when you talk to the experts. Not many experts think that is possible, but we wanted to include it. It would be sort of, it's within the realms of possibility if we really put a lot of effort into it. I won't go through this in much detail because I'll show you instead, but there are a lot of different areas that you can see the impacts of your choices. So you can look at lifestyle, as I mentioned, what happens to technology and fuels, what happens to land and food, which is a really interesting thing. And you can build your own vision, as I mentioned, and create your own link that you can share and save for later as well. So I'll show you how. And I did mention, one more slide, the pathways. These are some of the organisations we have pathways. So you're able to, as I said, see what the vision of quite a big range of different organisations with different opinions. using the tool. So now I'll give you the demonstration. I'll just seamlessly move over. Here you go. So this is the global calculator, and I've already explained how it works, but now I'll start actually clicking the buttons. So we talked about transport mode and the shift to public transport. When you open the tool, I should say, you are in a sort of slightly pessimistic scenario. It's the International Energy Agency 6-degree scenario. So this is business as usual. This is what would happen if we really didn't do anything to tackle climate change. So it's a bit of a scary future at the moment. So what you can see at the top is energy supply in 2011 here and 2050. 2011 was the baseline data for this model, and 2050. And you can see if we do nothing, we're expecting energy supply to go up quite significantly, and the blue is the blue there is fossil fuels. So if we don't do anything, we're going to keep using a lot more fossil fuels in the future. And why is that? Well, it's because the demand is expected to go up. So here's demand in 2011 and in 2050, and you can see that that's risen, and it's around, well, a bit under a third. Buildings is the purple, yellow is transport, and then at the top we have manufacturing in green. So we're expecting everything to rise, particularly manufacturing. That results in this middle graph of emissions from 1990s, that's historical data, up to today, and keep increasing here. At the moment, we've got significant increases up to 2050 and beyond. Year on year, which results in this very scary large grey column of emissions. This is the cumulative emissions graph, adding up all the emissions under the curve here. If you are playing this like a game, your target can be this red line here, which is a 50% chance of keeping the temperature to 2 degrees centigrade, which is the international target, or one of the international targets. There's also 1.5, of course. So at the moment, if we do nothing, we're expecting more than double the emissions than we need. So you can see we've way overshot the target here, and that is translated by the model into the temperature there, the thermometer, which is centering around 4 degrees. So now we're going to start making things better and rolling out some low carbon technologies. So for example, the transport mode. If I go down to level 1, this button here, that means that, as I said, that's a high emission scenario. That's 65% of journeys are made by car. But I can roll it out to level 2 is 53%, level 3 is 43%, and level 4 is 29%. So you can see that the emissions went down there, that the graph went down. So we're doing a bit better. And we could also try maybe nuclear power, as we mentioned. So we could go up to level, we're at sort of a bit over level 2 there. We could go to level 3, and you see there's a little shift. Level 4. See that even if we built the most nuclear power that we think is possible, we still haven't solved climate change. So that's a very quick message, is that that's not the only solution. So what else could we do? Perhaps we could try a few other things. Let's try some wind power. So I'll go up to a level 3, hydroelectricity, and maybe we could, what else? Bit of solar power. So you can see that by adding up these solutions, we are starting to have make a dent in the emissions, but there's still quite a long way to go. Maybe we could also change, so we use more efficient appliances and better light bulbs. You can see it's had a bit of an impact. So you can see that we keep adding up these solutions and seeing and making progress, but we're still quite a long way to go. You can click on these levers and lever name. If you click on the lever name, it will take you to a page which explains in more detail about what you're choosing. So like those graphs I showed you before. So you can either spend half an hour playing with the buttons once you get the idea and building up a pathway in a very quick way, or you can spend quite a long time looking at the detail, looking at the context of the technology or the behavior change, things you might want to consider, and then an explanation of what you're choosing with the levels. As well as this main screen at the top, this sort of overview of emissions, you can also look, as I said, in more different graphs. So, for example, here is some information about lifestyle, and this page has graphs about temperature of houses in the summer and winter and average household size. So one of the things you can do is make buildings smaller because they're more efficient, make people live in smaller houses. You can see that graph changed. You can also make houses building insulation, for example. You can increase that, and then you could make people use turn down their thermostats, for example. So you have a bit less warm homes in the winter and cold homes in the summer. So you'd have to wear a jumper in the winter and I don't know, open a window in the summer. So you can look at some quite interesting information if you're interested in energy. For example, we have a Sankey diagram that is changes based on your choices. So for example, if I take away the nuclear power that we've added in, you can see that that straight away, the nuclear bit, the red bit, disappeared and appeared again. So you have a way of showing how the energy is flowing from the sources to the uses here in an interactive way. You can also see more information about the climate. So you could see temperature change maps that take information from a lot of very complicated climate models and shows it for the temperature that you're at the moment. So at the moment we've still got quite a lot of temperature rise. So you can see in some of the runs we've got a lot of heating over the land and in different parts of the world. In some it's the models vary a lot. So we didn't want to say that there's one outcome and one answer to, which countries will be hot and which ones will be cold, and that there is a lot of variety because everything's very uncertain. You can also see precipitation maps as well, so an idea of precipitation change and ocean acidification as well, which is an important issue. So I think dark pink is bad in this graph. But for example, if we change to a pathway using the drop-down menu here, where we have reached the 2-degree target, it should be a lot lighter. So you see that changed, and the temperature change graphs would be a lot less dark red, hopefully. One thing I really wanted to show you is the land sector. So I've moved into, I'll move back to the scary business as usual here, the IEA 6-degree scenario. And the model includes a breakdown of how land is used from now until 2050. So this is historical data, and this is sort of around today. Oh, actually we're around here now, but 2010. And going up to 2050. The green area is forests. The pink area is land for food crops. And the red area is land for food animals, so pasture land. And already I think that's quite surprising, because you'd probably think that more land was used for food crops than for food animals, but that's not the case. So based on the choices you make, at the moment we've got a bit of a squeezing of forest, an increase in the amount of land area for animals, the red area, because we've got an increased amount of meat eating going on around the world. But you can change that and sequester more carbon in forests by changing diet, changing the way we produce our food, and changing how we deal with bioenergy, for example. So we have a diet section of the model here. We can change the average calories people are eating per day on a worldwide basis, changing the proportion of that's meat, the amount of meat in the diet, and then also the type of meat. So if we move from, let me make it slightly go down so I can read it. Level 2, where we think is the healthy amount of meat. So it's a bit of, we move up to level 3, which has more, say, more chicken and less beef. So it stays the same as today, rather than increasing levels of beef would be level 3. You can see that that made quite a big difference. The green area got bigger. And if I click it again and reduce to almost all chicken and pork rather than beef and lamb, you can see we've really reduced the amount of red and increased the green instead. So we've made room for forest, and that had a significant impact on emissions already. If you make everyone eat an Indian level, the average Indian diet level of meat, you have an even bigger change, and you can see the impact that has on emissions because we've sequestered all that carbon in the forests. I think people that are interested in energy could spend quite a long time playing around with this and seeing all the different implications that you're having based on your choices and the implications that's having for the climate. But even people that haven't been introduced to these concepts before can get quite a lot out of it about how things interrelate. So for example, one very quick example of this, we go back to the beginning. If we take a business as usual pathway and increase the amount of electric cars, so let's go to a significant amount of electric cars by 2050, you can see that actually emissions go up. Why? Because we're supplying electricity to those cars that's very high carbon, that's based on coal. So you see how things interrelate, that until you start producing the lower carbon sources, the renewables, the CCS or the nuclear, you will have an actual increase in emissions. So it's very good for understanding the way that things interrelate and the trade-offs you have to make. So I will move back to the presentation. So along with the tool, we released this report, in last year when we launched the tool, and we wanted to use the tool to show that firstly, it is possible to reduce to prevent dangerous climate change and keep to that 2-degree target, because when we started building the model, we weren't actually sure if that was the case, so we were quite pleased, and we developed some pathways ourselves that showed that the world can eat well, travel more, and live in more comfortable homes in the future. So people can keep developing, which is particularly important for the developing world, and we can prevent climate change. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive, but the model does show that if we're going to do that, we need to really transform the technologies and fuels we use. We are talking about quite a sea change in energy usage. Because of this trade-off, it is easier to reach the 2-degree target if we have if we really reduce demand, and the tool can show you that. One particularly important take-home message from using the calculator is that land is very important. I was showing you there the impact that it could have just with a few clicks. But we found that if we do want to continue growing our energy sort of usage or our lifestyle benefits of energy in the future, then we are going to have to actually reforest and by around 5 to 15%. And of course, at the moment, we're seeing net deforestation. So that is quite a big challenge. There's different ways you can do it. You can either change the way we farm or change our diets. I'll quickly show you how we came up with those actually using the tool. So what we did, if I go back to the 6-degree scenario, so business as usual, what we did was we kept all the lifestyle choices around how people travel and people's homes and their diet the same as business as usual, and all we did was change the technology and fuel levers, so how we supply those needs with energy. And we created, for example, this pathway, distributed effort, which is sort of an average one. You can see the sort of trajectory of emissions we're going to need to reach the 2-degree target, which means making changes and reductions and peaking, well, around now. And that's the sort of level of ambition we have to reach the 2-degree target. But you see, it is possible. So sort of a positive message there. So very quickly, how can you use the global calculator? Who is it aimed at? Well, it is aimed at business users, NGOs, governments, because although this information is held in a lot of reports and in a lot of very complex models, often decision makers don't have access to it themselves. And by playing with the tool yourself, you actually the messages get embedded in your brain a lot better, we find, because you've discovered them for yourself. So we want businesses to take this into account when they're thinking about long-term planning, you know, the sort of technologies that are going to be important in the future. NGOs to inform their long-term strategies, you know, they can show that they've got a plan that adds up. And also governments should understand what the 2-degree target means, and they could get some benchmarks from the tool that they could try and align their own plans with. Because we are talking about a global average with the tool, not any individual countries. But I think one of the most natural audiences for the calculator is for education, for universities and schools. And we know of a few dozen universities, without me really doing anything, are using the tool in teaching, because you can, again, discover the impact of different mitigation options yourself. So whether you're studying engineering, economics, environmental subjects, there's so many different topics where this playing with the calculator and global calculator and building your own pathway can have a really good impact. So, for example, you could use the calculator to build a pathway together in a class. If you have a sort of computer lab, you could task people to develop, you know, their own ones individually as a group, or you could have one big screen and build a pathway together with voting, for example. Or you could set it as a, you know, introduce it in a class and then set it as an interesting homework assignment, you know, build your own 2-degree pathway. What choices did you decide to make? Why did you make those? What did you learn? Is that the sort of future you want to live in, for example? Because it, as I said, can introduce people to a lot of issues around climate change and what changes we're going to have to make in the future if we're going to avoid it, as well as a sort of launch pad to discuss the pros and cons of different energy options, and try and link it more to your local area as well. We've provided some information and training materials on our website. There's a page called Presenting the Calculator on our website that has a big presentation pack that you could use. It has some speaking notes if you want to feel more confident presenting the calculator yourself. There's videos that summarize but also how to use it as well. So hopefully there's a lot of material to use, but we are also, you can email us as well if you have any further questions. So I think that's everything I wanted to say for now. So I could hand back to Jason maybe, and I'll just try and find my screen, Google Hangouts. And I'm glad you're still there, because I was talking to myself for so long and now I can see that we're still live. So. We're
still here. Thank you very much, Laura. That's actually very thorough. So I've played with this tool because, you know, well, running this initiative, we're interested in energy and climate and the connection. But I've learned actually quite a bit just by listening to you and seeing the demonstration. I didn't realize that you could open up all that back information that kind of explained how that tool was being, like that lever was actually affecting. I also didn't realize that all of the different scenarios that were already up there. So I'm going to have to go in there and explain it some more. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, if you want to just type them in, we're trying a new process here, so we don't see all your questions, but Emily, who is with Let's Talk Energy, will also be helping us by making sure we get the questions to us. I know that there's about a 1-minute delay, so we'll wait and see if anybody has anything that they would like to ask Laura or myself. And I was actually wondering, do you know if this has been used at all with high school students, or is it mostly universities?
From what I've heard, I think there's been some colleges, which one of them was Canadian, and I don't know, I tried to work out exactly what age group that was based on their website, and that could have been, it could have been like the last few years of high school or just after, so a higher education.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it was a further education college, but I think you could with the sort of, you know, senior type level high school under the right settings. I think you could have quite a good interaction with an engaged group. But different levels you can work at it, I suppose.
Have you done any lesson plans that go specifically with this, or you leave that in the hands of the teachers or the educators?
Well, yeah, I'm not an education expert. I've only got sort of quite informal educational experience. So I think I've put a few sort of suggested ideas on our pack of slides, but not any detailed lesson plans. I think I've tried to ask the people that have developed it to provide some things, and that sort of inspired what I put up there. But no, that's something I really would like to develop, but I know that we need to link up to organisations that work in this space more to do it properly, and I don't. Yeah, I'd rather do that than just have a go myself.
Right. Well, there's a challenge.
But if anyone wants to do that, then we'd be more than happy.
If I know there are a lot of people within our network who do environmental education as their specialty. So maybe I can try and connect you, Laura, after with some of the people here in Canada who specialize in that climate piece, because it would be really neat to develop some tools for teachers, because often it's the most challenging thing with teachers, as any of us who work with them know, it's making sure that their lessons are fitting into the curriculum targets that they need to fit in over the year. So if you can,
that's the trouble, that they vary depending on where you are.
Yeah, if you can hand them a package of lessons that accompany a tool, you're much more likely to get engagement.
Oh yeah, you've got a question. I was just going to say that we do have, we developed, this project comes out of work we did originally at the UK level, and as part of that we developed a sort of computer game simplified version of our model, which has a lesson plan used by teachers that was linked directly to our national curriculum. And I know we still get a lot of usage from that, and a lot of people creating their pathways because their teacher told them to. They tell us in the feedback. So yeah, that has been very successful, but be open to that in the future.
Yeah, well, it would be a great opportunity to get some lessons for some different levels of Canadian students. So I can maybe look into that with you later. The question here that I'm reading is, does the calculator take into account major climatic events such as floods, forest fires, climate refugees, anything like that?
So one of the areas I do think that some of we do include climate impacts at quite a big level. Climate scientists are funny people, lovely funny people, but they don't like to be very precise about things. Well, unscientifically precise. They're wary of that because they're working such a complicated area, and there's so much uncertainty. So that's why, for example, on our thermometer, we have a big band of potential temperatures. Our climate scientist was very clear that she wasn't comfortable saying this is definitely a safe level, because the world, we've never done this before. We've never done climate change before. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. We have put a little bit of information about the sort of things you might get more of, like floods and forest fires, but we have not been able to, at the moment, get to that level of detail, except to say that on some of the high temperature scenarios, you could expect that a lot more. But as soon as you start saying where they'd be or how often they'd happen, it starts to get very complicated. It's very complicated. It is something we'd like to do more of. We have, I didn't show you the cost section of the model, but there is a cost tab, and that looks at the cost of the system, of what you've built in the energy system, but it doesn't look at the cost saved. So that's one way you could do it, is to somehow work out what the average cost would be to society of adapting to or recovering from these sort of disasters. But that's the next stage. It's more complicated than I'd like it to be, so we've got to do it properly. But yes, it's a good point.
That actually leads into the other question here that I have, and it's what are some of the next steps for this project? Are you collecting feedback or analysis on the different pathways created?
I keep a track of all the pathways that are created, and definitely feedback. I'd love more feedback, particularly from this audience. As I said, this is the sort of thing we're thinking of doing more of in the future, is trying to link up with educators and produce materials that are useful to them. Because as I said, I really think this is, it's such a people that probably would, as you say, if you give them a lesson plan, they'd love to have it. So why not use that to increase that the audience of the tool? So that's one area I want to look at, developing the cost sector more, so you can include like health impacts and costs avoided, because at the moment it is, as I said, at a very high level, and working with our partners to do that, or potentially some more partners over the next year or so.
Okay. Okay, there's another question here. Can this be used for modeling a specific region or country? Or is it just global? Because you mentioned that there was based on one in the UK, and I know we've talked about this a bit, but how does that work?
Yeah. So basically, the global calculator is the global calculator. It covers the whole world, and one of the members of my team said it has takes the John Lennon approach of imagine there's no countries. So we've got what we're talking about, world averages here, world average lifestyle, world average or totals of energy usage. The approach has been used and originated at the country level and has been used for different regions as well. So as I said, it started in the UK to help us look at what we could do to meet our 2050 target, because we have an emissions reduction target in law that came in 2008. 2010, and that helped us internally as a department understand what our choices were and what our big choices were, what our big technologies were, for example. And since then, we've worked with China, India, Brazil's nearly going to launch, South Africa, Vietnam, Indonesia, Colombia, a lot of developing countries. In fact, we've supported them through our Climate Aid Fund to build their own models that are uniquely suited to their situation. And when we do that, we don't recommend you take the global calculator or the UK calculator spreadsheet and just change a few of the numbers to match, say, the Canadian totals, because every country is very different. Every country, or just even region, has very different challenges. For example, we're working with countries that have a much bigger air conditioning requirement than the UK, because they're tropical, and have big forests. So that's important to them when we've already chopped down our forests in Britain a long time ago. So you should start really from scratch and build your own model. And that conversation that you create by building it is a really important one. You are bringing together stakeholders from academia, from NGOs, from business, from government, to try and work out what the options are in the future. And we always recommend that governments do it themselves, or at least work on it closely, so they create something that's useful to them. I have been speaking to some provinces in Canada and introduced them to it. So there's been some interest, and we'll see, hopefully, that it feels like the time's becoming right to have more of this discussion in Canada. I know you're working on your long-term plan at the moment and you're having debates, so.
Yeah, it's definitely, I could imagine that there's a lot of variation between different countries. I mean, just you mentioned electric vehicles. So here in Canada, we have between our hydro and our nuclear fleet, I think we're at about 65% non-emitting. Maybe actually with the nuclear, I think it might be even up towards 80 of most of our electricity. Now that's very different though in certain provinces. So I mean, in Canada, you could nearly do a Canadian version, but as you're saying, you could even do a province by province, because Canada is nearly, it's regionally much different in its energy system than in some countries have. In their entire country, we have variations in provinces. And it's just because we have such a large country, but also. In a lot of ways, we're blessed with a lot of energy resources. We also have a lot of forests and peatlands and things like that can act as carbon sinks. We also have a huge agricultural system. So there's a lot of different factors playing on the Canadian reality.
Definitely.
So somebody else was asking, aside from, can you expand on what some of these next steps would be? Aside from reforestation, what else can we do? Are there any other big takeaways that show a real large impact?
Yeah, so I think definitely read our report for more details, but our big three electricity sources, because basically we're going to have to really almost completely decarbonize our electricity system worldwide, if we're going to do this, have a very low emitting, what's the word? The grams per megawatt hour or whatever of CO2. And to do that, the big three are CCS, renewables at scale like solar and wind, but in insignificant amounts, and nuclear. If you have 2 of those, you're okay at scale. If you only have 1, you start having a bit more trouble and it becomes very difficult. So that's one takeaway. One of the main messages is that we have to be ambitious everywhere. So there's no silver bullet. There's not one, get out of jail free card here. We have to be ambitious about reducing. It's not just about changing our supply. We've really got to be ambitious on the demand side as well, making everything much more efficient, hopefully limiting that, limiting energy usage without changing people's lifestyles so they're not still having the same outcomes, but in a much more efficient way.
Yeah, I did notice that when I played around with it, is that it didn't seem to make a difference if you just hit a couple of the levers. You really needed to get in there and play with pretty much everything if you wanted to be able to hit that 2-degree target with any certainty.
Yeah. And then, of course, if you don't like one thing, then you're going to have to replace it with something else, because it's basically a zero-sum game. So that's when it gets really difficult. This is a very difficult, and not all the options are, they all have pluses and minuses.
One of the questions is there a GDP, or I guess like a financial lever, to see how quickly the economics are growing globally?
So all the scenarios are aligned with, it's not an economic apocalypse. They're all aligned with GDP growth as we would expect over the next 30, 40 years. So cost sector is a graph that compares the cost of your pathway to a counterfactual. So you could have the business as usual, and we then compare it to GDP. So it's a few percent extra of GDP. It could be cheaper because there's a lot of uncertainty, but by changing from a business as usual pathway to a low carbon pathway, could be slightly more expensive or even cheaper depending on what you do. And you can think of all the benefits as well that you get of not having to deal with forest fires and not having to deal with flooding and migration, all those things that could come out of climate change.
So yeah, if you actually cost out some of those externalities and make them more internal into it, then it potentially could work out to be cost neutral or even saving.
The graphs would, that's what we want to do next, is to show that, because at the moment it's only a cost to the world, when actually there are significant savings that aren't being shown. And the graph also shows you the huge uncertainty we have around costs. When we're looking out 40 years in the future, what are things going to cost? We're not sure. And there's a huge amount of overlap in all the costs between business as usual and a sort of low carbon pathway.
Perfect. All right, well, I think we're going to wrap it there because we're getting towards about 50 minutes. I don't see any other questions here. But I wanted to thank everyone who's participated with asking questions and tuned in today, and especially wanted to thank you, Laura, for presenting the tool. I feel like I have a much better grasp on it, and I've played around with it quite a bit already. So having somebody who's been involved in the development of this is really useful. This video will be going up online, so if other people that we know are wanting to know more about it, I will definitely direct them there, or anybody else who, if you know somebody who couldn't tune in, please share the link with them. And as I mentioned before, you can always visit the initiative on our website, letstalkenergy.ca, on our Facebook page or Twitter at our handle @EnerTweets. So thank you again, Laura, and I look forward to chatting more. And again, if anyone is out there in that environment, climate, energy, education space, and they're looking at trying to develop something for teachers, please reach out to me and Laura, and we'd be very happy to work with you. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks.
All right, we'll stop the broadcast now.